All right. So, continuing in this essay, Liberalism, Reason, Peace, and Property. So I'm just going to read through and comment and then maybe do some tree stuff. You can see the tree that I did for the previous section, which is quite large. I feel like trying to move through this a bit faster now, though. So, I like the formatting that Elliot uses, by the way. Like making use of both different like font weight and style and color. Seems like a good idea. Anyway, so freedom of trade, including gift giving, follows from property ownership. Presumably, this would include inheritances as well. If I own a physical object, then it's mine to do with as I think best, which includes giving ownership to you. Yeah, that makes sense. That's sort of part of the idea of ownership, is that, as long as you aren't misusing the property in a way which violates other people's rights, then yeah. And even in that case, it's not that the issue isn't that you, the issue isn't an issue with the ownership. Like if you, I don't know, drive your car negligently and hurt somebody, like you still own the car. That was the issue, is that you own something and that's a potentially dangerous object and used it in an irresponsible way. But yeah, if you don't have the ability to dispose of property in a manner you think is best, then in some sense you don't really own it. I can also trade the services of my body, since it's my body, right? So like labor, moving, construction work, anything like that. Sexual services, which is an item of current controversy in many jurisdictions. Trade includes buying and selling. Money is a type of property which can be traded for goods or services. It includes hiring people for jobs, trading money for services. Now, I don't think this would strike people as particularly controversial, but I think, and I think he'll probably get to this, but he means it in a more robust way than, like, if you want to hire somebody for less than the minimum wage, you should be able to do that because the minimum wage is legitimate. And the fact that you can't without getting into legal trouble is a violation of freedom of trade. If you want to buy something from a foreign country and you can't because the tariffs are exorbitantly high, and whereas you could afford the item without the tariffs, with the tariffs you just can't. Well, the tariffs are a violation of freedom of trade, impinging on your ability to purchase an item. So trade allows gaining property without creating it yourself. Trade benefits people who have different values or situations, right? If everybody had identical preferences, then you might have some initial trading or some trading as new people were created or whatever, but if everybody wanted, one car, one computer, one set of plates or whatever it is, and maybe some people just happen to have an extra car, an extra computer, an extra set of plates at the beginning, and some people had none. Maybe there'd be some initial swapping or something to sort of get everybody into their initial identical preference position. But then, then it would be pretty static except for replacing things as they broke, I guess. So you'd still have some economic activity, but there'd be a lot less trading if everybody had identical preferences. I'm thinking off the cuff here, so I'd have to sketch that out more to think about rigorously the consequences if everybody had identical preferences. But it's not the situation. In fact, people have rather different preferences. I was talking with somebody who has one of the larger iPhones, and I wasn't aware of that. And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. I considered it because of the screen." And they said, "Well, they were actually interested in the camera and thought the screen might be a problem." So it's just one small illustration of how varied people's preferences can be, or even contemplating a purchase of the same mass market item. different attributes of the item can be pluses and different attributes can be minuses. So I may be short on food right now, or you may have extra, or I may like the taste of a type of food more than you do. Meanwhile, you want a sewing needle more than me because you have more time available to use it, or care more about holes in clothes, or you're more skilled with it. That's a pretty good, simple example. That's one general thing about Elliot's writing, especially his polished stuff, is he tries to use simple examples and not get too fancy. Food, sewing needles, these are things within ordinary experience. So I can trade something you value more than me, a sewing needle. I think you value more than I do would be better, because with the me, it sounds a bit like the sewing needle is being valued more than, Elliot. Which, I know what he means, but it's just, I notice these things a lot more now. Having made some formal study of grammar recently. So anyway, carrying on. Then we can both come out ahead. Right. Trade is beneficial due to diversity. If we're all identical in every way, then we wouldn't trade. So if people, assuming voluntariness, and sometimes you do get involuntary trades, like when the government forces you to sell your property, but assuming voluntariness, then in every trade, both parties at least think they're coming out ahead. Like one of them, so assuming voluntariness, and that's the key assumption. I was going to say fraud, but still in that case, both people might think they're coming out ahead. It's just that one person has, willfully withheld misinformation to create a false impression of reality intentionally. Or whatever the fraud is, but that's a common one for trade, like misrepresenting the quality, brand, or state of repair of some goods. This trade is beneficial due to diversity. If we're all identical in every way, then we wouldn't trade. Yeah, if we're all identical and we already had the initial set of stuff that we wanted. It's just going back to my thought earlier. Anyway, trade benefits people due to division of labor, letting people specialize. He defines it. I learned to make shoes well. You learn to grow corn well. We trade shoes for corn, right? That's another straightforward, simple example. I get better at making shoes because I can focus on it instead of also learning to grow corn and acquiring the land and tools needed for corn growing. The division of labor is intellectual. I can focus my learning on my specialization, and material, I only need the tools and land for my specialization. Right. That's an important point. If you cook a lot, you actually will have more space and equipment dedicated to that particular pursuit. So not only do you put effort into learning the actual mechanics of cooking and cooking properly and cooking safely, which is a serious, it can be a serious study if you start from a position of not knowing anything, which I did a few years ago, and you had to boil a box of pasta and that was it. But so there's the intellectual effort, but then there's also, the equipment and, the materials, the actual food that will take up space in your refrigerator and your freezer and possibly spoil if you don't use it in time. So not everyone has to learn to do everything and get the tools for it, which makes society far more productive than individuals alone on islands. All right, so I put some structure on the first paragraph. So I broke it down into scope of the freedom and trade. So we have, freedom of trade is the big idea that we're talking about. And then I decided that a couple of the sentences were about defining the scope of that freedom. And then a couple of the sentences were specifically about trade, what it is and what the consequences are that follow from it. So I'll use main idea. All right, so for the second paragraph, it basically said there's an example and some elaboration. and then we sort of come back to like an abstract. There's the main idea, right? And then an example and some discussion of that, and then a more abstract statement of the example, a consequence of that, and then a point that seemed like just an elaboration on the main idea. Like the main idea is trade benefits people who have different values or situations, and the elaboration is trade is beneficial due to diversity. So it's the elaboration is sort of answering why the main idea is correct. So this is pretty straightforward. For the third paragraph, we have the main idea, trade benefits people due to division of labor, an example of the benefit, and then some details on the division of labor and how it works. It's pretty simple. And now we get to trade is only voluntary. Yeah, I was talking about voluntariness earlier. I mean, I've seen the essay before, but it's an important theme. If either person doesn't want to trade, then no trade takes place. It takes violence to make someone trade when he doesn't want to, but that's theft, not trade. I wonder, there's the status of, like I mentioned earlier, the government forcing you to sell something. Like that obviously involves force, but like it seems different than theft, because for one thing, like a thief generally isn't trying to offer you fair market value for your property. They're just trying to take it. Whereas the government is supposed to, make some effort to offer you fair market value for your property, at least in the United States. Like if the government just takes your property, then that's theft. Like that, and the governments do that sometimes. And even in the United States, there's a lot of complaints about civil asset forfeiture, if you want to Google that. But it's also happened in foreign countries when they've nationalized some property. Right. So all trade is beneficial to everyone involved in their own opinion, or else they wouldn't trade. Liberalism tells men either voluntarily cooperate, trading, discussing other interactions, or else voluntarily leave each other alone but never use violence. Liberalism recognizes voluntary action as action controlled by a man's best judgment instead of by violence. Thus, voluntary action is necessary for reason to be used. It gives men the opportunity for rational judgment. And there's a connection here, I think, into the notion of economic planning. It's described by George Reisman, because when the government tries to plan everything, what they wind up doing is suppressing the plans and judgments of everybody in the economy, except a few people, on the central planning board or whatever. And then you have chaos because, you're trying to plan a whole civilization, a whole country, with, like 1/1,000,000th or billionth of the necessary thinking involved. And one thing that always strikes me, it's often, I've come across situations where it's like some purchases are very easy. It's like, yeah, that's fine, whatever. But some purchases I struggle with more, and I put a lot of thought into them. And we could be talking about anything from, a computer to a pair of jeans, nothing, not necessarily limited to a particular line of item. And if you ever tried, this is a point I've mentioned before, but so like purchasing stuff can be really hard for yourself. Like figuring out how you want to use your limited resources in a way that'll satisfy your needs and wants and desires. And if you try to purchase something for somebody else, even somebody else that you know closely, you'll realize that there's a lot of difficulties there. And that's because even the person themselves often has a hard time figuring out the best way to satisfy their own needs. So then another person coming in has like an additional difficulty because they don't have all the latest up-to-date information about what the person is into. And, a lot of people get stuff and it's like, they were into it like last year or 2 years ago. And the person giving the gift remembered that. And they meant well, like they weren't, trying to, like they were trying to be generous. but it doesn't, the gift doesn't land. It's not received well as something that's useful. They might appreciate the sentiment, but it's not received well as something that's useful because the information on which the gift purchasing decision was made is out of date. It's based on old market information, and so it can be hard to buy things for yourself. It can be harder to buy things for people you know well. Now imagine you're on the central planning board and you're trying to plan for everybody. Like, good luck, And that's sort of my intuitive argument against central planning from the fact that it's hard to figure out how to buy things, what to buy. But I think it's a legitimate point, Anyway, liberals pay more attention to what is voluntary than other people because liberals see how voluntary action relates to reason in addition to especially hating violence. Okay. Pretty big paragraph, or the paragraphs I think are getting, they're getting a little bigger, and then the last one is the biggest. So I'll make more mind map tree node things as I go. All right. So trade is only voluntary. Oops. All right. So I really use the ability to move things around and reorganize them in this paragraph because I found I needed to do a lot of that. So I've organized the content into a couple of conceptual categories: the voluntary nature of trade and liberalism. So under voluntary nature of trade, we have the stuff that I thought was so like the first sentence, and then the next bit's following from that, and then the consequence derived from that, which is when trade is beneficial to everyone involved. And then this whole rest of the paragraph I made sort of its own section because it's talking about what liberalism says. See, this section was about the voluntary nature of trade. So trade in reality and its voluntary nature as a relationship, between people, as an interaction between people. And then this was about the content of liberalism as pertaining to the issue of voluntary cooperation and trade and so on. So I think that structure makes sense. So we have a whole other paragraph on trade and voluntariness. So we'll read through that. So trade works by voluntary agreement. To avoid misunderstandings, complicated or valuable trades are written down. A written agreement is called a contract. Liberalism advocates freedom to make contracts. Contracts have to be binding for much trade to happen. You can't just back out at a whim, especially not after you've already gotten a good or service from me. You're not a slave who must obey a contract, but if you want to cancel a contract, then you're responsible for limiting the harm from your mistake. You made a mistake by agreeing to the contract, and that harms the other person who made plans relying on the goods or services you agreed to provide. That makes sense? What to do about canceling a contract can be written in the contract itself, but when it's not, or there's a dispute, then the law should decide the outcome via courts or arbiters. For small issues, it's usually not a big deal. Stores will just give you a refund, right? If the item's defective or something, it's implied that they were selling you a functional item, so. But for larger issues, e.g. an employer doesn't pay for you for the last 2 weeks, enforcement is needed. Contracts and their enforcement especially matter for enabling trade involving different times. For example, I buy fire insurance and pay now, and the insurance company needs to actually be bound to follow the contract in the future if my home burns down. And a lot of people have trouble in our semi-socialized, oligopolist health insurance market with, these quasi-state entity insurance companies, which don't sell health insurance. But I won't get too into that. But anyway, they have a lot of problems because, people purchase this health insurance, quote unquote, and then they try to make a claim on it, and it's like, going through litigation to get any action. it takes months, and you got to file appeals, and your doctor has to, it's a whole nightmare. So okay, the trade works by voluntary agreement is the first line, but it's sort of like a background premise. Like, this is really about contracts. That's the main idea of the paragraph. We'll call it the main topic. Okay. So for this big paragraph, there were a few sentences that I just grouped as like sort of background stuff. And then I had two categories for the main content, which is the binding nature of contracts and the enforcement of contracts and resolution of contractual disputes. It's kind of a long category title for, it's like longer than some of the sentences. Let's zoom in here. So you see for this one, it said, contracts are to be binding for much trade to happen. I didn't say that, but that's the stuff not in bold or not in all caps is like Elliot's content, unless I put comment. I was italicizing things before, but I just decided it's like too much annoying formatting that I can forget to do. Like, I was italicizing the stuff that was Elliot's. So we have this statement, and then the reason, and then an elaboration. And then I thought there were a couple of ideas here, so I didn't put like main idea, I just put like idea. Although maybe, actually I think there's let's try this. What you do about canceling a contract can be written in the contract itself, but when it's not or there's a dispute, then the law should decide the outcome. Yeah, I think this is an elaboration on this, because they're saying the law should decide the outcome, and then it's saying, basically, this paragraph is saying certain things won't even like become a legal issue because they're just small fry, like stuff that you'll just get a refund. But then some bigger issues actually need enforcement through the courts. And then this is giving a reason for why we need enforcement. So I think that's reasonable. Okay, call that a video because we got to the end of the section.